Hosting our program is Salim Firth. Dr. Firth is a research fellow in macroeconomics in our Center for Data Analysis. Before joining us here, he was a visiting assistant professor of economics at Amherst College and a visiting research scholar at Northeastern University. He and his colleagues in our Center for Data Analysis maintain scores of databases to support strategic research, provide confidential reviews of legislation to members of Congress and the executive branch, as well as supply data and analysis for news organizations. He earned his doctorate in economics from the University of Rochester, and he holds a master's degree in economics from the University of Rochester and a Bachelor of Science in Economics and International Affairs from Northeastern University. Please join me in welcoming Salim Firth. Salim?
Thank you all for being here today. I'm very honored that Heritage gets to host this event. It was always a risk in scheduling an event even only a week ahead of time with a crisis as fast-moving as the one that's occurring in Puerto Rico. There are things that have developed in terms of court decisions, agreements between creditors and the PREPA utility that have occurred since we planned this event. So this is very much in the news. It's moving fast. But I want to, and I hope that this event sort of helps us to get a bigger picture. Puerto Rico does not need to just get through the next month or 3 months. Puerto Rico needs a real way forward towards economic growth, to giving job opportunities to its young people, to its well-educated citizens, to its not-so-well-educated citizens. And if we don't fix the big picture, then the little picture will not take care of itself. I'm really pleased that in order to start that discussion, we have with us Anne Krueger. She wrote a tremendous report, which I'm sure you've all seen. There were copies outside when you came in. You can get one if you didn't. It's online if we run out. I'm going to introduce the speakers. Professor Krueger is going to give some keynote remarks, and then we have two excellent panelists to follow her, and then we'll have a Q&A. So we'll cover all the questions at the end if you have any. Anne Krueger is a senior research professor of international economics at the School for Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. She was the founding director of the Center for International Development and is now a senior fellow there. She's also the Harold and Caroline Rich Emeritus Professor of Sciences and Humanities at Stanford Universities. Anne Krueger was first deputy managing director of the IMF from 2001 to 2006. In the 1980s, she was vice president of economics and research at the World Bank. She has previously been a professor of economics at Duke and the University of Minnesota. She holds a BA from Oberlin College and a PhD from the University of Wisconsin. The econ geeks in the audience will know that Professor Krueger coined the phrase rent-seeking in 1974 in a paper that has been cited now 6,000 times. If you ever hear an economist talking about rent-seeking and you don't know what it means, you can blame Professor Krueger. Professor Krueger is a distinguished fellow and past president of the American Economic Association, a senior research fellow of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Econometric Society, and the American Philosophical Society. She's published extensively on economic development, international trade and finance, and economic policy reform. In addition to her writings on these topics, she's written books and articles on India, South Korea, and Turkey. Most recently, Professor Krueger and her co-authors, Ranjit Teja and Andrew Wolf, who's in the audience today, elevated the debate about Puerto Rico's economic and financial travails with their report, which is what brings us here today. What makes the Krueger, Teja, and Wolf report so valuable is that it convincingly shows that Puerto Rico is in an economic crisis first and a debt crisis second. There can be no satisfactory resolution of the debt crisis without restored economic growth. The panel that's following her will expand on her remarks, begin a discussion of how Puerto Rico got here and how Congress can help Puerto Rico return to economic growth. Some of you may have noticed that one of the originally advertised panelists, Daniel Hansen, is not here. He sends his apologies. He had to bow out at the last minute due to a personal emergency. Mike Gonzalez is a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Davis Institute for International Studies. If you guys could silence those, please. He spent close to 20 years as a journalist, most of them reporting from Europe, Asia, and Latin America. He left journalism to join the administration of President George W. Bush, where he was speechwriter for Securities and Exchange Commission Chairman Christopher Cox before moving on to the State Department's European Bureau, where he wrote speeches and op-eds. Gonzalez was born in Cuba and left at age 12 in 1972. He got his first regular reporting beat in 1980 with the Boston Herald. He went on to work for Agence France-Presse in 1987 and logged 11 years with the Wall Street Journal subsequently. His book, A Race for the Future, How Conservatives Can Break the Liberal Monopoly on Hispanic America, is available now. And finally, Nicole Kaeding is a budget analyst for the Cato Institute and focuses on federal and state spending policy. She co-authored the 2014 Fiscal Policy Report Card on America's Governors. I suggested to her that the 2015 edition should include Puerto Rico. Previously, she was the state policy manager for the Americans for Prosperity Foundation, where she oversaw the organization's activities in 34 states. Before that, Nicole was a manager and bank officer at 3rd Fifth Bank Corp. And a financial advisor at American Express. Kaeding graduated from Miami University and holds a master's degree in economics from DePaul University. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Krueger.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. As was already said, I'm going to talk about the report that the three of us did. Andrew Wolf was here, Ranjit Tejit, and myself, at the request of the Government and Development Bank in Puerto Rico, which is it is the fiscal agent for the governments. So we were and are basically consultants to the government, but the conditions of doing the report were that we were going to be honest truth tellers and tell it like it was, that was the only use, and that's what they asked us for. So I think we got access to all of the relevant information, although some of that information seems to change from day to day. But on the other hand, I think they were good at giving us access, and I think they wanted the honest report, and they certainly are in the process, I think, of digesting it. That said, let me move quickly because I haven't been given very much time, and it's one of those things that takes a lot of time to get through precisely because, as was already said, this is not a debt crisis alone. It is not a growth crisis alone. You can't fix one without the other, and it goes both ways, not just one way. So we concluded quite quickly, I think, actually, after looking at the numbers, that the current situation is unsustainable. But one of the reasons it's unsustainable is because of lower growth, and another one is because debt. Part of the reason growth is low is because of debt, and part of the reason debt is so high is because of low growth. So that you can't really disentangle them as much as you need to. And we also made a strong plea, which I'll come back to if time permits, as to the degree to which we could see a package going forward that would restore growth, what that might look like, and so on. Let me start with a couple of obvious things, but they're important. Puerto Rico is not a state, and it is not a country. It can't go to the IMF or the World Bank for help, and while it can come to Washington and ask, it has no standing as states do, and it can't do some of the things states can do. It has wonderful potential. Tourism possibilities are very large, but the number of tourist beds is no greater than it was in 1970, despite the huge increase in tourism in the Caribbean. I'll give you a reason why later, or one of the reasons why. It also is, because people there have U.S. citizenship, that's an advantage. It has the benefit of U.S. law and the certainty or the degree of certainty that that provides, which is an advantage. And resident Puerto Ricans who are not working for the U.S. government are not subject to U.S. federal income taxes, but they are subject to Social Security, which they then do get. So it's kind of a mixed system that way. Disadvantages, and there are several, include that it's subject to the U.S. minimum wage legislation. I'll come back to that, but as it turns out, it's huge. When I first learned that, which is I think last January, I thought, gee, that's not good. But since I figured out that that was probably the worst mistake I ever made, in that it's a lot worse than not good. That was praising it more than it should be. But there are other things, too. Chapter 9 of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code, which permits entities of states, including municipalities, including public enterprises, certain framework for bankruptcy does not apply to Puerto Rico. It's explicitly excluded, although, of course, it's included in minimum wage. So the one that would hurt it gets, the one that might help it a bit, it doesn't get. So one has that. There are a number of other congressionally mandated requirements, one of which is the Jones Act, which raises transport costs enormously going back and forth. There are environmental regulations that raise costs and prices and other things. I won't take time on them, but they're there. And there's some mixed blessings. Puerto Rico is tied to the U.S. dollar, which gives a lot of certainty and provides, but means that neither devaluation nor monetary policy are potential policy tools in a crisis. You've heard a lot about Greece, which is in the Eurozone. They can at least think about going to a drachma. Puerto Rico can't even think about doing anything else, so it has even less scope in that regard. While the Puerto Ricans are beneficiaries of U.S. welfare legislation, that has some downside effects, which I'll talk about. And because it supports many Puerto Ricans, it also raises business costs and fiscal costs. Membership in the FDIC has helped because there's no threat to the banking system, at least in the sense of a run, which is a good thing, although there were banking difficulties in 2009. So that goes both ways, too. Everything goes both ways in this regard. Well, let me start just a little bit of background, although I know many of you know more about it than I do. But these things are reflected in recent economic behavior. There were special tax exemptions for Puerto Rico, and in particular, U.S. companies locating there did not have to pay U.S. profits tax from the 1970s until 1996. In 1996, that legislation was partially removed. It was completely removed by 2005. Some of the companies that came in were very profitable. Puerto Rico had a wonderful boom. But since 1996, some of those guys have been going out again, and things since then have not gone so well. So there is a boom from it and a bust. One other word, which may be of relevance to some of you, Puerto Rico, of course, became a U.S. territory in the Spanish Civil. It's not Civil War, the Spanish-American War of the late 19th century. Be that as it may, what happened was that there was almost no change in economic status. It was a backwater island. Nothing happened until the 1930s when the Roosevelt administration took some interest in it. And Rex Tugwell, who was a member, as you may have heard, of the Roosevelt so-called Brain Trust, was allowed to, if you like, decide what Puerto Rico should do. And he established, or they established under him, a lot of public enterprises, which are part of our problem as we'll go going forward now. Okay. Since 1996, there's been virtually no economic growth. Successive administrations in Puerto Rico have tried fiscal policy thinking they were in recession. Puerto Rican real income has reflected a bit. U.S. Real income recessions, booms, periods, up until 2008 when Puerto Rico's fell into recession with the U.S. but never recovered. The fact is that Puerto Rico has been basically in economic stagnation for at least 10, and I would argue 20 years, which is the background to all of this. And in that process, the efforts to change things have been made in the fiscal space, which accounts for part of the fiscal difficulty now, but not the whole thing. So the current situation is dire. The Puerto Ricans have borrowed year after year at very favorable terms, triple tax exemption, and have borrowed with it. Debt has gone way up, and now the debt situation is dire. The fiscal position is unsustainable. Population started falling a while back, and so the labor force is now falling too. So not only do we have no growth, we have reduction in the labor force, and we have other things that can hurt. The three issues are interrelated. I'll talk about each of them. Without restoring growth, there's no possibility of a turnaround in the fiscal. Without turning around the fiscal, there's no possibility of growth. They must be addressed simultaneously. And they can't improve without addressing the high and prospectively unsustainable burden of debt that the Puerto Ricans are carrying. As we speak, the government's cash balances are critically low, and further delays, will reduce even further the room for maneuver and the chances that they can get out of this thing without further damage. So let me take what time I have, partly by talking about factors retarding growth. External factors to Puerto Rico have contributed. The removal of tax breaks that I mentioned obviously was a big one. The financial crisis of 2008 was big. Puerto Rico had a housing boom, as did the rest of us, but it has recovered much less since, for obvious reasons, with population falling. It's even longer time to work off your overhang. And so but the climb in oil prices also contributed because, among other things, of the high cost of transport because of the Jones Act, and because, in addition to that, PREPA, the electric power utility, is totally oil dependent. And so all of the electricity comes through that. The cost of electric power now, the price to Puerto Ricans is 28 cents a kilowatt, which contrasts with something like 10 cents in Texas, to give you just some order of magnitude. But internal factors also contribute. Employers are reluctant to hire because the federal minimum wage is high relative to productivity of unskilled workers in Puerto Rico. Some industries, such as tourism, which would use a lot of unskilled labor, and other activities of that kind, therefore, do not compete. There's no way on a $7.25 an hour minimum wage, which is probably going up, that Puerto Rican workers without great skills can compete with Puerto Rican tourist activities can compete with, say, Dominican Republic, where the minimum wage is about $1 or less, or even Mexico, where it's $2, in things like the package tourism, the holiday for your family for a week, which is not the upper. They have a little bit of competitive advantage in high-end tourism, but for the mass market, they don't, which is why there are those no more tourist beds, I think. Okay. There are other things that happen, too, but in addition, Puerto Rican legislation and practices have added significantly to labor costs. It's not just the minimum wage. Puerto Rico has shot itself in the foot even further by adding to that with things like requiring a 13-month bonus in December, giving very generous sick leave, which I guess from what we're told, employers can't really quarrel with, 30 days a year, plus generous holiday benefits, vacation benefits, etc. And so there's a great deal. We talked to the person who is managing the PREPA reconstruction, and she said that she has employees who won't see each other one day in the year because each of them is taking enough time with one of these things or another of these things. And she claimed that it's highly disruptive, even in something like electric power, where you'd think your technicians were at least a little bit interchangeable. Imagine what it does in other things. Okay. There are also very short probationary periods after 3 months. The worker is permanent unless notified he can't stay on after 3 months. They're more than 8 hours in any given day, you're required to do overtime. You can't do, 10 hours today and 6 hours tomorrow, which other companies can. You go down the list. There are a lot of them. Even on welfare benefits, Puerto Ricans say, although we didn't get quite the documentation on it I would have liked, that the benefits there go beyond what the U.S. Minimum under U.S. welfare law is, but I won't go into that. The welfare system does make unemployment unattractive, or makes employment unattractive for workers whose productivity is that much above the minimum wage. Apparently, we got one estimate from an economist, and nobody's really challenged it, that says that a family of 3, if the wage earner works, his net income is about $1,100 a month. If they instead go on welfare with food stamps and the other benefits they're entitled to, housing subsidy, etc., it's $1,700. So what are you doing? You're paying $600 a month to work. Well, would you be surprised to learn that the labor force participation rate in Puerto Rico is 40%, compared with 62% or thereabouts right now in the U.S., and we are worried that it's gone down from about 66 to 62. Puerto Rico's is 40. I wonder why, when you can sit home and make more money, especially if you're not terribly skilled. And about the estimate is that 88% of workers in Puerto Rico are within $1 above the minimum wage, or $1 above it. So it's a biting minimum wage. Transport costs are high. It's not only the oil cost and the Jones Act, it's also local regulations. In addition, local laws restrict domestic competition in a variety of fields, and so on and so forth. Outmigration has been one result. Workers who can't find work will go to Miami or to other places in Florida or New York or other places. And so you lose some of the more ambitious among your population because they're the ones who don't really want to sit there on welfare. Now, the public sector debt has risen in every year since 2000 and reached 100% by 2014. And this is when real GDP isn't growing. So you talk about a debt to GDP ratio. Any debt, net debt, is created when GDP isn't growing very much, is going to create a higher debt to GDP ratio. There are a number of institutional weaknesses on that, and one of the things our report focuses on, but I won't talk very much about here, is the desperate need for change in some of those. Projections of revenue and expenditure have been overly optimistic. Revenues too high, expenditures too low relative to what happened. One problem. There's been no midterm check that could do anything about it. So that in effect, even if various government agencies were notified, okay, you're overspending your budget, the most they did was stuff some of their bills in the drawer toward the end of the year and wait to pay them till the next year. Arrears amounted and were not counted as part of the deficit. So the deficit was not counted including arrears. It was not counted including cash drawdowns. So if the Puerto Ricans had bank accounts, which they did, and they drew some of it down in order to cover their expenditures, that was not covered. The deficit was defined really as borrowing, almost nothing more. And so one of the things we've said is that this is not the deficit. The deficit is your flow, and drawing down assets is not something that's sustainable. That's part of the stock. And you don't count it, but of course they have. And as cash becomes tight, has become tight, they've done some other things that hurt the position even more. They go to large companies that are still there, and they negotiate with them. They say, okay, if you'll pay your taxes now early to cover into this fiscal year rather than the next one, which starts July 1st, by the way, if you'll do it this year, we'll give you a better deal. So the companies negotiate on their actual tax rates below the legislated rates in order to get early payment. And of course, once that starts, everybody wants it. And it's kind of one of those things that's highly contagious. They're also something that they call, I forgot the name of it. Andy, what's the name of the things they call these when they do these composite? Yeah, where the closings, where they close the books at lower rates than are planned. So that the average take on taxes on business in Puerto Rico is well below anything that says on the rates that are listed in the books. There are numerous tax credits that reduce tax revenues, and there's even an agency that bargains with prospective, possibly incoming businesses as to how much a subsidy they'll get. Building a hotel, construction, got a 50% subsidy on this business, and there are more. Statistical and accounting practices do not let you monitor what's going on. We don't even have the GDP data yet, GNP data, either one, for the fiscal year that ended a year ago. Okay, but not to mention this past year, which ended June 30th, which you wouldn't quite expect yet, but they're just way behind, and the numbers that are reliable come out late, and so any monitoring to give you a feel of where you're at is limited and probably is more guesswork than anything else. As I said, cash drawdowns and arrears are built up, and each year, come at the beginning of the year, they'd pay some of them off, but the number has been growing, and it's now relatively huge. The general fund has been used as a measure of the fiscal balance, but it really understates the deficit, both for the reasons I mentioned and because the commonwealth credit status is not independent of other debt outstanding. PREPA is not part of that, but on the other hand, can you imagine? You can't do an island without electricity. You've got to keep PREPA or something like it going. And given the fiscal situation now, who's going to invest? It's a big, of course, they're working with the creditors, and we hope it works out. And obviously something will have to give, but it's not a big deal. So the primary and overall deficits are much larger, we think, than was recognized, and nobody has seriously quarreled with our numbers. The budget last year was supposed to run a surplus of revenue over non-debt expenditure large enough to pay all interest and amortization that was coming due. In fact, there was an alarming decline in cash balances as the surplus was $900 million only, and interest and amortization costs were $2.8 billion. Okay, now Puerto Rican income is on the order of $70 billion, so when you figure that's $1.9 billion right there difference, big. The three big state enterprises and the employee and teacher retirement funds are also running large deficits. The liquid assets of the government employee retirement fund have been drained, and those of the teacher retirement fund are going down. They did try to switch and did switch, at least in paying into the system, to defined contribution rather than defined benefits some years ago. But they had all those legacy employees from before, and they've used the contributions from the new from the later system to keep on paying the earlier employees. So there's almost nothing left in the defined contributions, and something's going to happen about that. And that's a government obligation as well. So if you look ahead, some kinds of things are foreseeable that will make the situation even worse. We think that these things together will yield an average deficit of about 5% of GDP or from fiscal 2013 to 14. Nominal growth is just 1%. It's minus 1 real, plus 2% inflation about. And so these deficits imply the rising debt ratios and explain what's going on fiscally. And of course, the creditors can see them and are now to the point where they are very reluctant to lend. Near-term prospects are poor. And if you look at uncertainties going forward, they are much more on the downside than on the upside. We tried to calculate what would happen going forward and tried to figure out what a reasonable way to do it was. And we figured, okay, let's just talk as if nominal growth will proceed at 1%, i.e. minus 1% real plus 2 inflation over the next. Now that's probably optimistic in two regards. One, if they could finance their debt, which they can't, and kept on spending as they have been spending, and then the debt would double within that period of time. And two, they can't borrow to finance it, so they're not going to get that. And probably they're either going to make adjustments or they're going to go into crisis. If they go into crisis, obviously things will be much worse than our projections, but we did not want to start on that basis, so we didn't. So we tried to look at minimum financing needs over the next 5 years from May 2015 on. But that was before the sales tax reform. That's the only thing we haven't taken into account. The result is a deficit of about 4% of GDP per year over the next 5 years. If pay downs, arrears, amortization, and the downside risks, such as the loss of ACA funding, et cetera, are taken into account, the total financing gap ranges between $3.5 and $8 billion per year through 2025. $8 billion is more than 10% of GDP. And as I said, with GDP not growing very much, that's the debt to GDP ratio going up very fast and obviously not financeable. So what we're projecting won't happen, but we just wanted to get a feel for the order of magnitude. Now, growth and fiscal adjustment go hand in hand. Most countries that have come out of debt difficulties have done so in part by reducing expenditures and writing their fiscal balance, but in much larger part by doing things that restore growth. And in Puerto Rico's case, that's going to be, I think, absolutely essential. If fiscal adjustment alone were used, the resultant austerity would certainly yield stagnation, if not decline. And one of the things in Puerto Rico's case is that there's a little bit of room for a few taxes to be raised with some revenue results. But if they start trying to raise tax revenues very much, people are going to get on those airplanes or on those ships, and they're just going to come to the mainland. Outmigration will increase. There's already a large informal sector. The number I've heard is 23% of the economy, but nobody knows. That could increase. The idea that very much can be done on the tax side seems implausible on the face of it. One has to guess that if you raise taxes too much, you're going to just lose population, and revenue will, if not go down, it certainly won't go up, and I would guess go down, but we don't know that. Fact that solutions have been tried and failed in the past every year practically, for the past 10 years at least. The governor of the state has said, okay, we've got to do something on the fiscal side. And the first thing they gave me was about a 3-page list, single item, of each of the many things they had done in an effort to address the situation, each of which probably did a little bit, but each was kind of like putting your finger in the dike over here, and then it came out over here, and then it came here and here. It did not address the fundamental issue because real income was going down at the same time and because there was no growth. So in that sense, there's going to have to be a bold approach where there are both fiscal adjustments, yes, as best they can, but not so much as you go into austerity and find that real GDP is falling so fast that even though, because that would cut revenues too. But in addition to that, it's going to have to take into account bold measures that will improve the business climate significantly and enable Puerto Rico to get on some kind of a satisfactory growth path. So we think I'm going quickly because I'm just about out of time. We think that there are a lot of needed structural reforms which would have benefited Puerto Rico some time ago. They've probably been foolish to have them this long, but on the other hand, they've got to do something now for sure. Removing disincentives to hire workers in whatever way they can is certainly a key. Now, if I were dictator of the United States, I would probably do something like change the minimum wage law so that a low-income state like Puerto Rico would have a minimum wage that was the same percentage of the average or the median, whichever you like, as on the continental United States, or some other measure like that that would really cut the bite of that minimum wage to some extent. I'd then introduce it gradually. I wouldn't cut the wages of everybody already on the job, but do something there. There are things they can do even before that, though. They can, for example, have longer probationary periods. I'm no lawyer, but I would guess there are ways that you can define apprenticeships in such a way that minimum wage would not apply for a period of training, which would increase workers' productivity, which would enable employers to hire more. And there are a number of other things we've singled out in the report that you could do that would make a difference. But the minimum wage is a major problem. And as I said, they could cut out the 13-month bonus. They could cut the number of days sick leave. They could do things like that. So there's something they can do on their own, and everything they do will help. The question is, will it be? How much will it be, and would it be enough? There are lots of things that could be done in other regards. In the ranking of the World Bank in doing business, the United States mainland comes out 7th. Puerto Rico, 49th. They have a lot of things in the way they pass the laws and also in the way they implement them that are not friendly to business. Property registration takes forever and is one of the worst. But there are several others. Paying taxes is apparently difficult. Large staffs of businesses have to hire for that. Starting a business is, but again, laying workers off is one of the ones where in Puerto Rico there's big trouble. And in other countries, easing layoffs has done more to increase prospects for improving employment than almost any single thing you can do otherwise. It's amazing when employers, when they know that they're going to have to keep these workers on for why not hire them? Why not get a machine? Whereas when they can lay off, they get more variable cost, and there are other benefits besides just simply what's there. Now, eliminating the deficit would take so much that it can't be done quickly. There's no way. Or it can't, because if you try to cut down so much austerity, you'd lose the income, so you couldn't do it. And if you tried otherwise to borrow, you can't borrow that much. So there's going to have to be some kind of fiscal adjustment. We tried to identify, first off, the measures that could be undertaken by the Puerto Ricans, and I've already mentioned the U.S., that would indeed cut their prospects for what they now are, to make them less bad. But then in addition, that still leaves a huge gap that has to be addressed, and we tried to look at what might happen to growth. But even if they take all the measures that we recommend or something similar, that takes 2 or 3 years to take hold. So in our forward look, which is fairly pessimistic, they need help from themselves, they need help fiscally, they need help on the institutional side, they need better incentives to become more business friendly in a variety of ways. They need to do all that. But in addition, there has to be some way of phasing out or phasing along the debt, maybe a short period during which their principal and interest are rolled over, something like that, to give them time to get the effect of the growth-enhancing measures to work. Nobody knows when they start these processes how well they'll go, how fast they'll go. You can't tell in Puerto Rico's case. Part of it depends on what happens in the world economy. We don't even know that. Part of it depends on how quickly they can act, and, of course, there are political constraints in Puerto Rico. The first thing, I think, however, is that they themselves have to realize that if they don't do it now, it's going to be even worse and even harder later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I'm in the unenviable position of having to follow Professor Krueger, who's excellent, who's covered talked to you about many of the highlights in her report that I was going to cite. Her report, I want to redouble what Salim says, is really excellent. When we got it here, we all started sharing it. We all read it. I don't want to damn you with praise, but what we say is like, this report is so good, it could have been written here or at Cato. I thought it was highly commendable that the government of Puerto Rico commissioned this report. I thought it was. I watched the government's reaction to the report online. He gave about a 20-minute speech. I thought it was less commendable that he rejected many of your proposals, although he accepted a couple. But he did say this is a report worthy of serious consideration. That's to say the least. But please, all of you, do read it. Puerto Rico is. I've written about it a little bit. I wrote about it in my book. It always leads to great confusion. It puts me in mind of a skit I once watched on Saturday Night Live in late 1976 when President Ford, towards the end of his term, thought one of the things he wanted to do on his way out was make Puerto Rico a full-fledged state. So there was a skit called A Weekend Update with Emily Littell. Emily Littell was a commentator, was frumpily dressed, and used to get everything wrong because she was hard of hearing. And she commented on President Ford, said, "Now here President Ford wants to make Puerto Rico a steak. What does he want to make a mistake? If you make Puerto Rico a steak, the next thing they'll want is a baked potato with sour cream and chives and little pieces of bacon. Then they'll want a salad bar." And then the hostess said, "Miss Littella, no, it's a state. President Ford wants to make Puerto Rico a state, not a steak." And she goes, "Oh, well, that's very different then. Never mind." And I think for example, when we wrote about Professor Krueger's paper, and we wrote about the Jones Act and saying this is a really bad thing, Puerto Rico should be exempted from it, we were attacked by a group in New York that said we had sided with pro-independence groups on the island because there are two Jones Acts. You see, the first Jones Act I think from 1913, is the one that makes 17. Yeah, is the one that makes Puerto Ricans citizens of the United States. So half the country believes that Puerto Ricans are immigrants. The other half of the country believes that Puerto Rico is a full-fledged state, and it's a very confusing thing. But another confusion we have seen is this thing of access to Chapter 9. Politicians of both parties, including the former senator from New York, Hillary Clinton, have come out and said, well, we don't want to have a full bailout of Puerto Rico, but we do want Puerto Rico to have access to have the Chapter 9 protection. And of course, that is a bailout because the creditors who bought Puerto Rican paper, Puerto Rican debt, bought it at the rate that they did because Puerto Rico is blocked from having access to Chapter 9. So another comment by Mrs. Clinton that I found troubling was when she said the federal government should partner with Puerto Rico by providing real support and tools. The record will show that the federal government has already done much damage by partnering with Puerto Rico and the things it has done to Puerto Rico. Now, Professor Krueger referenced some of this when she talked about how Puerto Rico had kind of been, for the first 30 years, we didn't pay that much attention. And then Franklin Delano Roosevelt started paying attention. And that's when really we began to put in the culture, the economic and political culture that you have today. Now, Professor Krueger is very even in apportioning blame to the federal government, to the local government. She went into some of the things that the local government has done badly. Obviously, borrowing beyond its means is one of them, and the very onerous labor rules that it has prevented disincentivized Puerto Ricans from joining the labor force. But the feds have contributed mightily too. One of the things that I thought was the key, the single most telling statistic in Puerto Rico, as Professor Krueger has it in her report, is that only 40% of the adult population versus 63% on the island is employed or looking for work. We contribute to that through our federal policies, as Professor Krueger already mentioned today, it is better if you're a rational actor and you're only thinking in terms of the short term. It is better to go on welfare, about $600 a month better to go on welfare than to work and to get a minimum wage job. By the way, minimum wage is very high It's about 77% of the per capita income versus 28% in the mainland. Now, don't get me wrong. I think the U.S. did the right thing about Puerto Rico when it liberated Puerto Rico in 1898, along with the Philippines and my grandparents in Cuba. But then what it has done since then, especially since the 30s, I think has established the culture of dependency that I think we have today, unfortunately. Eleanor Roosevelt kind of like foretold what was going to happen. She went to Puerto Rico in 1934 and was appalled by the conditions. And then she also was briefed by very liberal, very leftist politicians on the island. She came back, she wrote for a magazine. We're at last waking up to the fact that a long-term plan must be made for this island, and it is at present being worked out, including all the government departments concerned. You know trouble is coming. And in fact, that same year, Rex Tugwell, who Professor Krueger already referred to, went to Puerto Rico also, and he was probably the brightest in the brain trust of FDR's, but he's also one of the most leftist. In fact, he ran the Supreme Court and did some of the things that he did here. Then he was exiled to New York. But the first thing he did was in Puerto Rico was worked on the 500 acres law. This is a law that preceded him, but it was a law that limited acreage to 500 acres. Now, of course, this was a huge infringement on the right of private property. It would never have been tried in the other 50 states of the mainland, or however many states were there in the 30s. But in Puerto Rico, this was something that he really wanted to see succeed. One of the things that FDR did also was in 1934, he transferred the administration of Puerto Rico from the War Department to the Department of the Interior, especially the Division of Territories and Island Possessions, and it was led at the time by a very liberal politician, another one, Ernest Gruning, who right away began to groom another bright but also very leftist politician, Luis Muñoz Marin, for greatest things. Now, the main, as Professor Krueger said, what they set up was a lot of the government being one of the leaders in economic activity. And they also wanted to break up the sugar monopolies and promote the type of small-scale agriculture that socialists, especially New Deal socialists, so loved, and that sometimes doesn't succeed. And one of his last acts, it was Puerto Rico. FDR actually appointed Tugwell as the last non-Puerto Rican governor of the island. He had a huge impact on the way the first constitution was written. He had a huge impact on his successor, Luis Muñoz Marin, who became the first Puerto Rican governor, the first elected Puerto Rican governor, who started Operation Bootstrap, which many people say succeeded in some ways. Other people with whom I agree say there was more of a failure. It was social economic engineering. We can say that it happened, that it was. At the same time, we saw the huge wave of Puerto Rican immigration into New York. So we shouldn't be surprised by what we see today, the food stamp participation rate of 40% compared to our already very high Obama-era rate of participation of 13.7% here in the mainland. And another statistic that Professor Krueger didn't mention, that's the Social Security disability payment participation, which it hovers around 21% of workers. That is actually low if you consider that according to the Social Security Administration itself, federal regulations require that disability adjudicators allow a disability claim based on a claimant's inability to understand the English language. This is in an island where 95% of the people speak Spanish at home or higher, and where over 80% say they don't understand English well. So right there, we actually think that we could see that the disability claims in Puerto Rico could be much higher, according to Social Security Administration's own rules. So I think that as we look forward, we should think of our own complicity in what has happened in Puerto Rico, be a less hubristic and think more, that's very different than never mind, and be more cautious about what we do with the island. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heritage, for having me. I will echo Mike's comments about how amazing this paper is. The morning that it was released, my research assistant actually ran into my office, was like, this is what we were looking for. This is what we needed. It had everything that we really felt captured the essence of what's happening in Puerto Rico. So my job on the panel today is to really touch on how Washington has affected the crisis in Puerto Rico, in particular to expand upon the comments about the federal minimum wage and its effects, and the Federal Jones Act of 1920, the second one, and its effects on the island as well. So as has been mentioned, the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour does apply on the island. But because the median income in Puerto Rico is much, much lower than on the mainland, it's about 40% of the mainland, it has a disproportionate effect on the individuals and workers on the island. 28% of individuals in Puerto Rico earn $8.50 an hour or less, compared to 3% on the mainland. And a previous study in the 1990s had looked at the effect of an increase in the minimum wage in Puerto Rico and its effect on employment, and found that an increase in the federal minimum wage had decreased employment on the island between 8 and 10%. Very, very large impact. And so if we equate all of these numbers between the difference in median income between the island and the mainland, what we're really talking about is it'd be similar to having a minimum wage on the mainland of $19 an hour, which is well above even what many on the left are pushing for right now with their $10 or $15 an hour. $19 an hour has dramatic effects. In particular, a 2012 study by the World Bank looked at 186 countries around the world and compared the minimum wage to worker productivity. Looked at what that ratio looked like. It said that Puerto Rico was 160th out of 186 countries around the world. And that ratio, Puerto Rico's, was 2 times higher than its regional peers of the Bahamas and Jamaica. It was 3 times higher than the U.S. mainland, and it was 6 times higher than Mexico. So not only does the minimum wage drive up the cost of employers that are already in the island, but it discourages other corporations from investing in the island because they can go to other areas in Latin America and have more productive workers and pay them at a lower rate. And where you really, really see this effect is particularly among lower skilled individuals, the individuals who typically are affected by the minimum wage. And we think about this a lot in terms of people of lower, who are younger. These are people who are, by definition, lower skilled. They don't have a lot of work experience. They maybe have just finished high school or college, and they're looking to enter the workforce. And so if we look at the unemployment rate for individuals between the ages of 16 and 24, here on the mainland, it's just over 12%. And there's actually been a great deal made about the fact that those in high school and graduating college face an uphill climb in trying to find jobs in this current economic climate. Right now in Puerto Rico, it's over 40%. Much, much larger. And this then discourages individuals from pursuing employment. Right now, the labor force participation rate for 16 to 24-year-olds on the mainland is about 55%, slightly less than it is for the population as a whole. But in Puerto Rico, it's only 34%. So that means only 34% of individuals in Puerto Rico, the ages of 16 and 24, are employed or are looking for employment. This then will have long-term effects on the island going forward. As individuals have less skills, they're unable to find work, they're unable to improve themselves. It encourages that dependency on government that is already being exacerbated by the fact that there's a $600 difference between welfare benefits and what the minimum wage will pay you. So what can Congress do about this? Of course, there's a few solutions. The ideal, coming from the libertarian, would be that we didn't have the minimum wage. But realize political climate makes that a bit difficult. So what could they do? Dr. Krueger talked a little bit about you could lower the standard for Puerto Rico. You could maybe make it put it into a closer ratio than what it is on the mainland. You could also look at creating some sort of training wage, which is common. In the U.S., we have it on the mainland. It's only like 90 days, very, very short. But many OECD countries actually have a training wage. Some countries will say it doesn't apply to workers below the age of 18. Some go as far as saying workers under the age of 25 are not subject to the minimum wage, or instead of 90 days, it's maybe 6 months, it's maybe a year. So looking at these sorts of changes to the minimum wage could help particularly those younger workers get experience and join the market. And then second, I want to talk about the Jones Act. The Jones Act was passed in 1920, pre-New Deal. What it says is that any goods being shipped between a U.S. port and a U.S. port, those goods must go on a ship that was built in the U.S., that is chartered in the U.S., and has a crew that is based in the United States. So this dramatically limits competition and dramatically limits the ability of goods to move back and forth between the mainland and Puerto Rico. In fact, there's only 4 shippers that operate on that route. And so what you would expect is what happens. The cost of shipping goods to Puerto Rico is quite expensive, particularly when you compare it to Puerto Rico's regional neighbors. In 2012, the New York Fed looked at these shipping costs, and they said that it cost just over $3,000 to ship a 20-foot container full of household goods from the East Coast of the United States to Puerto Rico. That compares to $1,500 for that same container going the same route by going to the Dominican Republic, or just under $1,700 for that container going to Jamaica. So we have dramatically higher shipping costs going to Puerto Rico. And so what we've seen from 2000 to 2010 is that shipping volume, for instance, in Kingston, Jamaica, doubled. It decreased by 20% going into Puerto Rico. And in fact, Kingston has overtaken San Juan in terms of total shipping volume, even though Puerto Rico's economy is 3 times larger and their population is a third greater. So what we're seeing is that this Jones Act from 1920 is making it incredibly expensive for goods to go to the island, but it also puts Puerto Rico at a disadvantage because it makes it harder for them to export goods that are created on the island as well. They are not in a cost-competitive situation to other Caribbean islands. So what we have these 2 laws that are working together that are making it incredibly expensive to do business in Puerto Rico, both for employers and businesses that are already on the island, but we're making it incredibly prohibitive for other corporations or investors to come into the island. So what can we do in terms of the Jones Act? Of course, repeal of the Jones Act would be the ideal situation because it provides unnecessary subsidies to U.S. shippers and to U.S. ship makers. But more pragmatic would be looking at something, maybe an exemption for Puerto Rico. Even ideal would be permanent, but even something temporary on a 3 or 5 year basis would allow us to truly see those effects, give Puerto Rico a leg up. And that has precedent. The U.S. Virgin Islands is exempt from the Jones Act. In fact, that was a condition of why we were able to get the Virgin Islands from Denmark, was that we said that we would exempt them from those provisions. Guam is also partially exempt from the Jones Act. There is some push as well. Hawaii and Alaska have these sorts of effects too. But so overall, what we see is, well, Puerto Rico, as Dr. Krueger has laid out, has done a number of things wrong. They have not tackled this crisis. They've borrowed too much. They've spent too much. Washington is not innocent in its role as well.
Thank you. Tremendous. Thank you both for those comments. We've got some time for questions. We'll try to conclude at a reasonable time, and the speakers will be here for a little bit longer if you have further questions that don't get addressed. If I call on you, please wait for the microphone and identify yourself and your affiliation.
Hi, I'm Gretchen Sierra-Sarita. I'm a freelance writer. First, Dr. Krueger, thank you for your report. It's been very useful to everybody, and we really appreciate it. I have a question for you. The day after, or the weekend after, or soon after your report came out, Governor Alejandro García Padilla made an announcement in a TV speech that we all heard that the debt was unpayable. Assuming that when he said that, he was factoring in the unpaid or unfunded pension plans, as well as the looming healthcare crisis, where our Medicare Advantage is going to be cut by 11%, and where the Affordable Care Act funding ends in the very near future. So we're in the end of a health cliff that will also have to be addressed. So I'm assuming he factored all that. But as you probably have heard, the discussion in the island is this really true? Meaning, if we have access to federal bankruptcy law, which is not a bailout any more than it's a bailout for municipalities in the U.S., it's an inequality thing, Mr. Gonzalez, but if we do have access to federal bankruptcy law, then we would be able to pay the debt long term. Now, I know in your report, you were working with the information you had, but it's kind of hard to tell whether you were being slightly optimistic or slightly pessimistic going forward. So can you give us an honest, nonpartisan, which I know you will do, opinion on is that really payable? Thank you.
And Krista, can you or Henry, can you check if that microphone's on? Because I'm not sure that we actually picked it well. I think everybody here heard, but for online viewers,
It has a green light.
okay. Then it's just turned on. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that question, actually, because it seems to me that one of the things that confounds discussions like this, and not only for Puerto Rico, but in many cases, is that it's, and in fact, you referred earlier to the possibility of bailout, that this was a bailout.
Yeah.
Well, it's not a bailout in the following sense. If Puerto Rico keeps going along the path it's going, which it can't, but if it deteriorates worse and worse and doesn't try to do anything about it, the amount creditors will get paid is even less. It's not a question of full payment, or there'll be, or then we'll get Chapter 9 of that. Chapter 9, like most bankruptcy, is intended, the rest of the bankruptcy law, so that when there's something there, you can save what's of value in the assets. That's the whole rationale of bankruptcy. Now, it's a tough call because you want to make sure that you're not too favorable either to creditors or debtors. If you're too favorable to creditors, nobody will lend, and if you're too favorable, nobody will borrow. And if you're too favorable to debtors, nobody will lend, and so you don't want that. And getting the balance right is hard. But on the other hand, in Puerto Rico's case, the debt would double in 5 years, 200% of GDP, and then if they could borrow, they're already borrowing at 10% or thereabouts. They issued a $2 billion thing last year at 10%. Imagine that they double the debt at 10%. Then you're talking about interest costs alone on the debt. I'm doing this at the top of my head, so it's probably not right. But more than 15% of their GDP per year. That is not doable, period. So the creditors aren't going to get it. The question is how much they can get. And an orderly process that which gives Puerto Rico enough space to get the growth going again is going to do more. Otherwise, people are going to keep leaving. The tax revenues are going to go down. The tax base is, of course, going to fall. And what's going to happen then? It's going to be even worse. If I could just make a couple more points while we have it. The second thing was migration. I just want to add to that. Not only will it continue, but notice one other thing about out-migration. It's more of the unskilled workers than of the skilled workers, which is very interesting. What does that tell you? The skilled workers are the ones high enough above the minimum wage so they can more likely find employment in Puerto Rico. It's the unskilled workers who are going to New York and Miami, and that's where they're losing their competitive advantage because some of the things the Caribbean islands are great at use unskilled workers. So it really is a double dip on that thing. So basically it seems to me that there's just no way around concluding that the minimum wage is a problem, although, as I said, Puerto Rico could do some things to lower that, and you're quite right about longer apprenticeship periods and other ways of loosening it somewhat and giving more training, which would be good too, but nonetheless it's there, and then we have all these other disadvantages too. Sorry, I'll stop there.
Terrific. Thank you. Do either of the panelists want to jump in on this question? Another question? Young lady in the back.
Thank you. Kasia Klimasińska from Bloomberg. I have a question to Anne Krueger about the current debt situation. I mean,
Hold it further from your face. It's too close and I'm just blurring.
okay. Is it no better?
Yes.
I mean, I think you believe that some of the debt should be delayed. Could you elaborate on, how much of the debt do you think should be delayed and for how long?
Except for what we said in the report, no. The answer is I can't, and that is between the creditors and the debtors. And one of the things I hope from this report is not only will the Puerto Ricans recognize that they have a really heavy load to carry in terms of policy reform in general as well as that, but that the creditors will recognize that without some kind of reprofiling or whatever you want to call it, that they will get back even less over the longer term. Now there are inter-creditor disagreements there, which would also make that much tougher.
Sir.
You have a question over here too.
First of all, my name is David Metzner. I'm with ACG Analytics here in Washington, a research firm. I want to thank Heritage for this event because I think it's gotten some of the issues out in front. The debate in Washington seems to be focused on Chapter 9, debt, and Dr. Krueger, you went on and talked about the structural reforms that the government needs to do. When the governor spoke, he kind of sidestepped that part of the problem. And I think Washington needs to come up with both sides of when the debate gets to both sides of the equation, I think we'll see some serious focus happening. But what I'd like to ask, and I think it's implied in your report, you said intercreditor disputes. How does one look at the GO bond, sovereignly backed debt of the island? I mean, is that part of the problem, or is that protected, or people bought that with a sovereign, constitutionally backed guaranteed? I think Chapter 9 would not be able to restructure that. So what are the options or the tools?
In law, almost nothing. As you know, the court turned down Puerto Rico's appeal yesterday on that. So basically, in law, there's nothing. And as I said, the real constraints on the bargain are what is feasible. And quite clearly, if the creditors don't give, they will get less over the longer term, maybe more next year, who knows. But the Puerto Rican economy will just tank faster. So it seems to me that that's where the trade-offs are, and that's where people have to focus. This is not a question of should they pay or should they not pay their debts. They cannot immediately pay all their debts. Therefore, the question is how much will they be able to, and that depends in part on the bargain. I can't say more than that, and obviously that would be between the creditors and the debtors, but I think just as the Puerto Ricans need to look and see what can they do to restore growth, because that's good for them anyway. So the creditors need to look and see what will happen if we don't do anything.
I'll jump in here. I'm not bound by any relationships with any parties here. So for some of you will already know this, but so there's these general obligation bonds, which are sort of the most senior sovereign, supposedly backed by the full tax revenue of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. Less senior to that, essentially, are kind of these sort of state-backed debts, particularly of the utilities. There's also bonds called COFINA, which are backed by sales tax revenue, but seem like they're less senior than the general obligation bonds. So this is why you get some of the creditors disagreeing. The general obligation bondholders would love to see the utility debts, like PREPA debts, forgiven, because then that would make it easier for the state to pay them back in the future. And to your point about Chapter 9, it's if Chapter 9 were applied to Puerto Rico, as if it were a state, then the GO would not be covered by Chapter 9 because those are strictly state bonds. They're not municipal. And so in the U.S., those would not be covered. And it's absolutely clear, I think, and reading what some of the creditor representatives are writing in the media, I think it's clear to everyone no one's getting what they thought they were getting originally. And the question is, Chapter 9 versus the current law situation, how does the resolution get taken care of? And each side has its own sort of sense of, we feel like this resolution mechanism gives us a better seat at the table, and that's the debate that they're having. I don't, obviously the worst thing is for the creditors to just walk away from the table and say that they're not going to negotiate. I think in the media we're seeing that they, at least the paper creditors, are certainly at the table. They have been for a year. And the governor's recent speech will probably bring a lot more of the creditors into some active negotiations. My opinion, and the reason I think this event is important, is the worst thing that we can do is just resolve the present debt crisis. Because then we saw this with Greece. In 2011, they defaulted. It was orderly. It was a haircut. But some people didn't get what they were promised and got bought out at 50, 60 cents on the dollar. In 2012, they had another structured default. And now in 2015, we're looking at another, they've defaulted and now actually on the IMF, who'd sort of assumed all this debt. If you only do the default and the austerity and you don't do the structural reforms, you just come back to the same situation. And that's for the Puerto Rican people and also for the creditors, but really for the islanders, the worst thing that they can do is just try to solve it as only a fiscal problem without looking at the structural, the economic side. Another question, I had one over here.
Thank you. David Lewis with Manchester Trade here in Washington. I'm actually a former government of Puerto Rico official decades ago. I cut my teeth in economics with Lance Taylor decades ago when we were, everybody was in debt. Central America, Mexico, Argentina, and I thought we sort of forgot about that, and it's fascinating, this kind of study, and I'm sure it's going to produce another cottage industry in economics and grad students and so on, so congrats to the team. I'm wondering if, Professor Krueger, you could share with us a bit more, if it's available, case study situations, PREPA, the Power Authority, on other utilities. 5 years ago, it was almost AAA. It was actually ranked the #1 public utility in the United States. I was working in the energy sector, and obviously 2 governments did not make certain decisions right regarding reform of the energy matrix, shale gas, take advantage of that, and so on. And now it's, I guess, CCC plus or something like that. At some point, that's got to have to be restructured, regardless of what happens with the rest, and all of our other public corporations, which worked. That's the part of the New Deal and Bootstrap that worked 60 years ago. We're now in a whole different economy. So I'm wondering if there's anything within the work or forward-looking about what's going on with that and how that could actually work out. And then a point of clarification. I think if we look at the migration data from the state of Florida, it's professionals, capitalized professionals that have been leaving, doctors' offices, accountants' offices, mortgages, tuitions, and so on. We now have a phenomenon on the island. Well-established 80-year-old private schools are getting ready to either close down or reduce their numbers because the market is just not there. So the low skill, maybe they're leaving now, but over the past decade, and Orlando is a tribute to it, and you'll see it in the 2016 elections, it's well-to-do professional Puerto Ricans, well-capitalized, who just took it all, and it's a win-win for Florida. Thank you.
On the first, I don't know of such a study, but you're right, that will be interesting, and I sat down with Lisa Donahue, who is the one doing it, and it's fascinating to hear all the different ways in which she's finding, I found $73 million here, I found $29 million over here, as she's going through the various things that make a difference, but that will be a fascinating study. As to the low-skilled business, I think it has changed for the worse in recent years. One of the things we thought, and it's politically sensitive, so I'm not sure how we should have done it or how we should do it or how they should do it, but there's a huge subsidy to the University of Puerto Rico. One of the big parts of that is to their medical school. there's a huge out-migration of those medical school graduates for obvious reasons. And yet, am I right, there's about $1 billion a year about now?
Of the subsidy?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's $1 billion, and the overall deficit's about 9. So Puerto Rico University's big in that. Meanwhile, a lot of students are actually getting Pell Grants with tuition is low. At the same time as they're getting the subsidy the other way and pocketing the difference, there'd be a huge saving there. But apparently, there have been efforts to do something about that, and it's been politically volatile enough, so they haven't been able to do it. But something where students who needed it got a subsidy, but not everybody did, and they raised tuition, would be one big money saver that would probably also be efficient. And there are others like that too. The numbers we were given did suggest that it was the unskilled who were moving out now, but in fact, that's even in this Congressional Research Service report that just came out too. And I think it's in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's latest report in Puerto Rico. So others believe it. Whether that makes it true or not, given the state of Puerto Rican data, I'm not sure.
I think what you said was right for the first decade of this century, that it was professionals who were going to the I-4 corridor between Tampa and Orlando. But I think it may have flipped in the last 4 years. One of the most telling statistics in Professor Krueger's report is when you say in your recommendations, Puerto Rico currently has 40% fewer students and 10% more teachers than a decade ago. Mm-hmm. I think that's a result of the out-migration. One of the more disappointing, if I heard the governor right, he said, no, we're not going to do anything about that. And that was one of the areas where I thought he could have been more open to change, given the huge outlay.
That's great. Sir?
Yes, my name is Federico de Jesus. I'm also a former Puerto Rico government official. I'm currently a consultant. So I had a question for Mr. Gonzalez and then for Ms. Krueger. For Mr. Gonzalez, it's really more of a comment. You mentioned that Operation Bootstrap was a failure, but in the 1940s, Puerto Rico's income per capita was about $130 per person per year. And after the industrialization process, that income per capita rose to $3,000 per year per person, and it was basically the showcase of democracy that was built. Puerto Rico was poorer than Haiti, and it became a modern country. Were there mistakes? Of course. But people had to be given shoes and land and alphabetization. So to say that it was a failure, I think it's a kind of a misnomer. But to Ms. Krueger, I just wanted to ask, you're going to New York on Monday. How would a restructuring work if there are holdouts, like in the case of Argentina, where 90% of the bondholders agreed, but there were a couple of holdouts, and that's been in litigation for about 10 years?
All I can tell you is that in any restructuring, it's between the creditors and the debtors finally as to how you agree on that. And once something happens, if they're a holdout, it's then up to the debtor to figure out what they're going to do about it. I can't give you an answer, a firm answer, because I don't have one.
There's some of the debt issues have specific rules in them, sort of where there's a majority rule vote, so of 60% or something. But that differs by bond issue.
I did say there are strong arguments by people who say that Operation Bootstrap worked. But I mean, you do also have to remember that hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans went to New York who didn't want to go, obviously. They would have rather stayed at home. So you have to balance one thing with the other. But
Those were the unskilled.
all right. There you can, but they left.
All right, let's keep this orderly, please. I have another question in the form of a question. Sir.
Hi, good afternoon. First, I want to thank the panel and also the Heritage Foundation for hosting this event. I appreciate Dr. Krueger's, particularly your initial remarks, because I think they addressed what is the biggest issue, and that's the fact that Puerto Rico is not a sovereign country, we're not a state, and my concern is that given that reality, we lack access to the tools that we're going to need to even implement many of your recommendations. I'd like to hear, as you said before, just yesterday, the U.S. Court, the Court of Appeals for the First Circuit decided against the government, pretty much saying that Chapter 9 of the Bankruptcy Code preempts the Governor's Recovery Act proposal, and therefore it's invalid under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. So given that reality, how do you see us moving forward? That would be
Well, as I tried to say, I think there are a lot of things that can be done that would accelerate growth. There are things here that if Washington did would help even more. I'm pretty sure that Washington won't do much until Puerto Rico does some things on its own, would be the first statement. And I mean, that's a bipartisan statement, and it's not clear what you think. I mean, that's a prediction, not anything else. And that's my reading of it, nothing more than that. There is a lot Puerto Rico could do. This doing business thing is serious, and it wouldn't, it seems to me, take that much in that island. I mean, Puerto Rico ought to, in my judgment, be a attractive site for any European or Spanish company, especially, or Portuguese company that does business in both North and South America for a Western Hemisphere headquarters. There's very little sign of a lot of things that could come up in Puerto Rico with changes, some of which have to do with things like the hostility toward doing business, and have almost nothing to do with some of these things. The tax law is not repressive, that's not an onerous to that extent. There are other things there for a skill. You could get some of those things going. Tourism, quite clearly, I've been surprised how many people who don't know what I do is work, but they just started, where were you when I was in Puerto Rico? Oh, aren't you lucky? And then they'll talk about how they went there once, but they couldn't afford to go there again, and they go to some other island where it's cheaper. Now, this is a sample of one, and I don't meet everybody, and these are just a taxi driver or somebody I just happen to, they ask where I'm coming from or going to, and I tell them, but there's just tremendous potential there, and the real crime is how much of it is wasted.
I could have a follow-up.
Make it quick. I'm going to allow
Just
one more
my,
question after this, just because
yes,
it's already 1:10.
Going back to my big a lot has been said in recent days, and even in this panel, we've talked about minimum wage, and we've talked about Jones Act exemption, and things of the like. On all of these issues, we're at the mercy of a Congress where we don't even have voting representation.
Okay,
And
but
my concern is how can we? What is your view on?
well, first off, Puerto Ricans themselves are not united on this, and if they got together, it would help. But more than that, if Puerto Rico changed its law so that there was a longer probation period, that would help. It wouldn't turn things around alone, but it would help. If Puerto Rico changed the generous treatment it gives to its workers and sick leave and stuff like that, that would help. Puerto Rico is accepting people for disability rates are higher than they need be, et cetera, et cetera. I told you about 13-month wage. Well, that raises, that's 8% increase above the minimum wage. Why do that? And I can go on down the list. Why not have a 2 or 3 year apprenticeship period? That would, again, get people more trained so their productivity would be higher even at this minimum wage. It wouldn't solve the problem, but it would move things in the right direction. And as I said, once Puerto Rico gets together and becomes much more business friendly, there's a lot of suspicion now. If that happens, that could help a lot, I think, in terms of the willingness of people here, based on the comments I've heard, to be willing to do other things. I do think there's a case for the change in the minimum wage. I think it could be made. I happened to talk to a couple of economist friends in government, one of whom when they found out I was working in Puerto Rico, before I said a word, they said, I think that minimum wage law is the most disgraceful thing I've heard. And this guy's fairly influential. So it does, I mean, people are beginning to recognize it, but Puerto Rico, I think, in its own interest, needs to get its act together too, and that's difficult also, as it is anywhere.
All right, last question, gentlemen here.
Yeah, my name is Bob García, former United States Congressman and also a member of the New York State Legislature during the 70s when we went through our crises with the Municipal Assistance Corporation and how we were able to put that together. And being in my 80s now and having been through a great deal of wars and politics and everything else, this will come to pass. Everything comes to pass. Everything comes to pass. How does Puerto Rico now? Everything's gone. Bankruptcy, we're not talking about that. It's an island and it's a people under the flag of the United States. And as a former congressman, I know that congressmen rule. The United States Congress rules. Everything being equal, where does Puerto Rico go? Does it remain where it is? Does it go forward? I'm talking about all of you folks, the four of you, are speaking on behalf of solving problems in Puerto Rico, knowledgeable people about Puerto Rico, but where do we go? Do we remain the way we are? Do we become independent? Or do we become part of this union? I mean, that's a very basic question.
Well, as I said, there are advantages to being in the United States, and don't forget them. They're huge. There are also disadvantages. But if things go as they're going right now, as I said, population is going down. Things are going, I think, to get worse. And what will happen to Puerto Rico is it will become in population and in income not bigger, maybe even smaller. So where things are going is not desirable, and that's what it seems to be. In terms of Puerto Rico's own interest, there's a lot that could be done.
Madam Professor, just a follow-up, a quick follow-up. As I started my conversation, everything being equal, the crisis is gone. The crisis is gone. We're 5 years down the pike. Where do Puerto Ricans go?
So
Everything isn't equal is the answer.
Okay.
Meaning that until things are done here, it can't get to there. And that's the problem. 5 years down the line, if things are done right, Puerto Rico can be in great shape. If things aren't, Puerto Rico's population will be smaller, etc. I think it's not a choice between this way, that way, and that way. It's a choice between that way and that way.
Mike, do you want to tackle this question?
Just very briefly,
Nicole, if
I
you wanna have some
appreciate
final remarks.
your perspective on this. Look, I mean, we don't have a position on this yet, so we would talking amongst. We don't know if we're going to have a position on that yet. But Puerto Rico, when I hear Puerto Ricans speak, when I hear the governor speak, they talk about nuestro país, our country. Puerto Rico does have a sense of shared experience.
You ever hear me say that?
Yeah. No, okay. No, but I'm saying, but he does. He does. And many of my Puerto Rican friends do want to become a state, but whether that presents a stumbling block towards full statehood, I'm not sure. And we haven't worked that out yet. When the United States bought Louisiana and then acquired New Mexico, New Amsterdam, and it took in population that was not of the same type as the country was then. I'm not sure that Puerto Ricans will want to do the same thing. Like, for example, Louisiana in 1821 had to transfer all its laws into English. Everything had to be promulgated in English. So this is a big debate, as you know. It's not just political; it's economic and cultural as well. And that's all I can say. That's where I will leave it. And it is a big debate and a big issue.
And Nicole, would you like to just give us some final remarks? Nobody directed their questions at you.
Sure. So I think the one thing, particularly going back to your question, that I think can be instructive is look at what happened here actually in the District of Columbia in the mid-90s. DC also, like Puerto Rico, is exempt from Chapter 9. They also have no voting rights in Congress. We actually, unlike Puerto Rico citizens, those of us who live in DC, we actually pay federal income taxes too. And so what happened is that DC created a control board. This also happened in Manhattan. It's happened in a few other places where we avoided the bankruptcy, but we went through, created a commission that got down to work and dramatically changed the budget. We had huge budget deficits, over $1 billion here in DC. And in fact, last year, because of the success of the control board, DC passed tax cuts, which in a city that is over 80% Democrat, controlled on the city council, was a pretty big step that we have changed our budget. We've completely changed the way that things happen in DC, that we were actually able to decrease taxes. Now, it's not a perfect analogy, because DC, of course, benefits by the fact that Congress is here. Congressman, it's top of the mind. We also benefit a great deal from the large amount of money that is here from the federal government. But there are ways to move forward to restructure the debt, these conversations between debtors and creditors, as well as fixing the Puerto Rico budget itself, that are outside of the bankruptcy. And my concern, if they went the Chapter 9 route, is that it would, in essence, allow Puerto Rico to kick the can and allow them to not institute the structural reforms that are so badly needed on the island.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here.
And if that happened, Puerto Rico is on the, if they don't get Chapter 9 or something like it, again, restructuring.
Thank you for being here, and I hope we see you again here at the Heritage Foundation.